Hello, everybody. I am Eric Trexler. I'm here with the good Dr. Eric Helms, and you are watching or listening to Iron Culture presented by the Mass Research Review. So, thanks so much for joining us on this Monday evening. We have a lot to get to, Helms. But before we get into all that, let's exchange the pleasantries. Do the whole fake friendship thing. How you doing, buddy?
Oh, I'm so glad that you asked me that, and we can also pretend as much as you want that we care about these responses. But I'm doing well. The only thing is, I was cooking, and I was grating carrots, and I either my wife or I got a little bit of extra protein. I guess I wouldn't get extra protein. She would because I lost the protein.
Yeah.
So, folks, be careful when you're grating. Make sure that you don't try to get. I was getting too
Ooh, yeah.
like obsessive with wanting to get just the full length of each time, and yeah.
Yeah, I was actually pretty bloodied up yesterday.
Were
Helms,
you?
we were talking. I'm doing a lot of like packing stuff for a study I'm running, like packing up boxes and stuff. And there's just a lot of box cutting and a lot of knives and scissors out. And yeah, I was not being careful because I had a lot to get to. So I had more than one wound going at a given time. But yeah, so we're in the same boat there. Not to one up you, because believe me,
Oh,
nothing I experienced was anything like kitchen cuts are really, they tend to be very nasty because you're using stuff that is intended to really get in there. Like you don't want to mess with a grater. I'll take a little miscellaneous scissor cut any day.
the problem is last thing before we get over our battle wounds
Yeah.
is it's in a place where each time I train, like it starts to clot, it starts to heal over, and then anytime I grab anything hard, and I because I have a background in big weightlifting, I tend to hook grip a lot.
Oh yeah.
Um, Basically just directly squeezes it. I forget about it. I don't feel pain until I notice things that are minor like this. So then I look up and I'm like, oh, my whole thumb's red. I'm like, God damn
Yeah.
it,
Mm,
And we're back.
that's a bummer, man. But in better news, I found something that I want to alert our listeners to. This is something I was not aware of, and I was pleasantly surprised. Helms, what do you know about Mountain Dew Baja Blast?
I know that it has not made its way here to New Zealand,
Yeah.
and if there's a diet version of it, then I am quite disappointed that it hasn't made its way here.
Yeah, so Baja Blast is it's incredible. It's a lovely soft drink made by the good people at Mountain Dew, and they do a good job with their non legacy flavors. Like they did Code Red a while back, which was awesome. They had an orange version out for a while. That was really good. I don't know if they still do it, but I had never seen these available outside of like niche. Like I remember Baja Blast used to be like a Taco Bell thing. Like you'd go to
Yeah.
Taco Bell, it would be in the soda fountain there. I was at my grocery store the other day and saw Mountain Dew Baja Blast Zero Sugar canned. And I took those home because I was like, I haven't tasted this since I was like 12 years old at a Taco Bell near the Kings Island amusement park. I remember it vividly because I was like, what a beautiful nectar that I'm tasting for the first time here. And I'm drinking one right now, and it's like whatever problems you thought you had in life, they just melt away. And I know we shouldn't be doing free, unsponsored content, but
No, this is how you get the sponsor. Bring that close. I want people to be able to see the brand.
Mountain Dew
We're getting
Zero Sugar Baja Blast, it is just absolutely delightful. So I'm going to be in a particularly good mood today. And I know what you're thinking. Are you sure that Mountain Dew Baja Blast Zero Sugar is necessarily the most natural paleo approved beverage choice out there? I'm not sure of that. I have good reason to believe it's not, but we have a lot to talk about tonight when it comes to things that are synthetic. That is my official segue because Helms, for the first time ever in the almost what have we done, like 329 episodes of Iron Culture, I think.
Yep.
In the first time in history, I was given a homework assignment, which is that every now and then we get asked questions about Tupperware. We get asked questions about microplastics, and we said enough is enough. We need to actually bite the bullet and dig into this. And this is tough, man. To give a little peek behind the curtain, there's a fine line to balance where when you're someone who decides I want to do evidence-based content creation, you have to decide on what. And one place where people get in a lot of trouble is they don't really define what is my kind of sphere or domain of expertise. A lot of people can tell you what their main sweet spot is, but you kind of have to have these like the inner circle of topics and then kind of your safe ring outside of that, and then the stuff beyond that where you're like, I just can't touch that stuff. And it's really hard to tell the stuff in the middle where it's like, okay, I didn't really do my dissertation on that. I didn't take 3 PhD level courses on that. I didn't deal with that as a practitioner on a daily basis. Like there's some of those things where you're like, is that close enough within reach that I can go get to it by doing, several hours of digging into the research and kind of trying to self-teach a little bit. So this is one of those topics that I, for a long time, had kind of put it on the shelf out there where I'm like, I could access that, I believe, based on my background knowledge, but that's going to be some serious work, you know?
Right.
So finally ripped off the Band-Aid, did the work, and I've got results to share, Helms.
I'm excited because I had a really tough homework assignment related to this too. You said, Eric, so I don't forget to do my homework assignment, can you send me a message at some point to remind me to do it? So I had to open an internet browser, open a tab, sign into my Google account, go into my Google Calendar invites, and on a day where I had some time to send a text, I had to put a notification, Trex message microplastics. And then I had to get my phone out when that notification happened, make sure my notifications were on, and then send you a text that said, yo, space, microplastics. So
Yeah.
we've both put in a lot of hard hours for this one, and I'm personally quite proud of us.
Yeah, if this were an academic paper, it'd be the type of thing where we would be co-first authors, because who could
Yes,
possibly choose who's first and who's second here? It's a complete
absolutely.
50-50 split. So Helms, let's dig into this a little bit, and before I get into the details, a literal tip of the cap. If you're watching on YouTube, I am literally tipping the cap to Cassandra Rauert, who wrote a great paper January 2025. And if you want to understand like why I put off a lot of this background research as homework, the title of the paper should make this pretty apparent. First of all, the journal is Environmental Science Technology, not exactly a journal I frequent. The title is Assessing the Efficacy of Pyrolysis Gas Chromatography Mass Spectrometry for Nanoplastic and Microplastic Analysis in Human Blood. Okay, so a lot of words in there describing a lot of lab techniques that are very expensive and things I don't do. So this is a really specialized kind of dig, and this paper specifically was a huge resource. So I want to just kind of give a few like question and answers here, and then we can get into some of the nuances. So one of the first questions that I think is worth bringing up, what are microplastics? They're tiny plastics. That's pretty simple.
Excellent.
And so when you read these papers about microplastics, they'll distinguish between microplastics and nanoplastics, but we're talking about very, very small plastic compounds. Now, very important question, how do we consume microplastics? Because the original question we got was about, I heard that I'm eating microplastics. That doesn't sound nice. I've heard that there's a substantial amount of plastic in my body because of that, and that doesn't seem very nice. But it's really important, before we get into, this food versus that food or this cooking approach versus that cooking approach, how do these things get in our body? And the exposure pathways include ingestion, so eating, certainly drinking, inhalation, and potentially dermal exposure as well. So we are getting these microplastics from, it's not just like, well, you chose one of the few bad foods or you kept it in just the wrong specific type of Tupperware and you alone are screwed. We're getting this stuff from the next sub question. Where do these things come from? They come from our clothing. They come from food. They come from air. They come from water. They come from cosmetics, and that includes things like shampoos and toothpastes. So if you're like me and you're like, oh, thank God I don't wear makeup, cosmetics is a broad category, and there's a lot of stuff that pretty much everybody's using. And then other environmental sources as well, even things as simple as household dust. So, like,
Great.
if you want to be afraid of microplastics, sometimes there's the scare, fear mongers who are like, it's literally everywhere. Well, it is. Like, yeah, it's in your water, it's in your house right now. Whatever room you're in, it's behind you at this very moment.
Is it underneath my desk, Trex?
Yes, and if you're like me and you're not an avid duster and you don't do like really rigorous vacuuming protocols with really with like HEPA filtered vacuums, then yes, it's under your desk for sure. Now here's the next question. So we know they can enter our body in many different ways. We know that they are easy to avoid as long as you can avoid clothing, food, air, cosmetics, and your environment. So as long as you aren't interacting with any of those, you're good. Uh, the question is, though, are they a problem? And that
Ah,
is a really loaded question. So that's why I ended up with this paper I just mentioned, which is a very, obviously from the title, a pure methods paper, right? So they're not going out and saying, hey, we're going to figure out if you have a plastic spoon or a credit card in your brain or liver or whatever. They were just like, how could we even know where these are and
right.
how much is really there in terms of particle number? So our current understanding when it comes to the fate of these microplastics once they get into the body, which as we just discussed, they will,
They do.
you know, we still have extremely, extremely limited knowledge about where they go and to what extent. And then a whole separate question would be once they're there, what do they do? Right. So
Do they
it's
do they stay?
exactly. So we need to we need to figure out where do they get to? Do they pass by or do they accumulate? And if they do accumulate, what are they doing there? So it's really important to recognize like this is one of those areas where it's really frustrating because once we hear that something could maybe be a problem, we are used to living in a world where you hear about a new thing and you kind of expect that now that you've heard about it and care, you kind of almost feel like you should be afforded the privilege of let me get to the bottom of this. And 20 minutes later, after Googling and maybe having a little discussion with ChatGPT, you should have an answer that's based on things that are currently known.
And more than that, Trex, I think particularly in our kind of realm of the fitness industry, people want to also have agency to do something about it and change it, which is
Right.
why this area is kind of fraught. And thus far, it's not sounding good as far as the what can you do to avoid it front, but I'm
Right.
hopeful that you're going to give me good news as we continue.
Right. So let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. So
All right, I'll
the
dial it
important
back.
thing, the question is, are they a problem? In order to determine that, we would need to know how much is coming in to the
Hmm.
body, where does it go, is it accumulating, and if it accumulates, what is the impact of that? And I just want to let people know that this is a new thing. Like we were not worried about this in 1986, at least not that I heard of. So this is a pretty new thing. The research is extremely preliminary. And so what that means is you're going to have to kind of settle in and get really comfortable with some uncertainty on this topic. Because if anyone's going to sit down and tell you, like, I know exactly, where they're going, the extent to which they're accumulating, what they're doing, and the kind of downstream physiological or pathophysiological effects of that, I distrust them from having that level of confidence.
Well, that's a good first thing to conclude. So if
Yeah,
you do hear people, because this is the type of this is iron culture 101 is get a good bullshit sensor, identify charlatans, and identify the increasing number of people who sound scientific and may even themselves be scientists, but are actually not giving you evidence-based information. And this one is perfect.
Yeah.
It's a great you can scaremonger, you can get the clickbait, you can get the headlines going, and then you can, based upon that fear and the fact that you got someone hooked, uh, you're getting their amygdala going, all these emotional responses. You can tell them, follow my protocol. You can monetize that or just maintain their attention so that your advertisers will keep paying you. So be aware of how this information is given or weaponized, which should be a red flag.
Yeah. I'm going to lean on a quote that I'm probably misattributing. I think I first heard this sequence of terms by Robert McNamara, former, was he Secretary of Defense, I think, in the United States? There was a movie called Fog of War. But I think it was him who was talking through, like, there are known knowns. These are things we know to be true. And there are known unknowns, which is things that we know we don't know. For a long time, this whole microplastic thing was what the third category, which is unknown unknowns. Like, we didn't even really know to be asking questions about microplastics and what they might do in our bodies. So for me, the state of the evidence with microplastics is that we are watching them shift in the last like 5 or 10 years from being an unknown unknown to a known unknown. And what everyone wants it to be is a known thing. And we're not quite there yet in terms of the health impacts. But anyway, let me be clear about one thing here. So when it comes to these different studies, you're going to see headlines that say like, hey, it looks like you have a plastic spoon in your brain, or it looks like you got a credit card in your liver, or whatever they may be. It's really important to understand that the measurement methods for microplastics essentially originate from testing in water. And this is something I know a little thing about because, a lot of the some methods of testing doubly labeled water were originally derived for geological purposes, like measuring naturally occurring isotopes of hydrogen and oxygen in water samples. And when you start going from water to urine and blood, there's some extra steps that need to be layered in there because you're like, well, blood is not water, urine is not water. And so we need to make sure that we are preparing these biological fluids in a way that we can actually use some of this water-focused testing and kind of adapt it accordingly. So there are a lot of different ways that people have tried to approximate, they have tried to quantify microplastics within biological tissues or samples. And there's just a total lack of standardization. There's all these different methods out there because it's such a new thing. And as a result, it's led to a state where a lot of the research emerging in this area reports really wide ranges of concentrations of microplastics, really wide ranges of particle sizes of different microplastics. And some of them are being published and they lack biological plausibility. And so what I mean by that is when it comes to microplastics, and we're talking about traveling through a body, at a certain point, it's just a matter of stuff has to fit through stuff, And
Yeah.
so like we can actually
There's physics.
yeah, like
There's microphysics involved.
exactly. And so you're like, well, what do you mean it's biologically implausible to say that a particle this big was found over here? And when we're talking about microplastics, one of the things that's really interesting is like the size really matters when you're talking about where these things could be and what their fate ought to be in the body. So what I mean by that is like there are some capillaries where when you get down to the smallest part of the capillary bed, they're only going to be like, I think 7 to 17 micrometers in diameter. And so basically the nerds out here have kind of calculated out, and it's like, well, you're reporting particles that had to have passed through these tiny capillary beds to even get to the tissue you're talking about. And these particles are way too big to fit through any of these capillaries. And then there's also a question of, well, if some of these small particles get in our body, where will they go? And particles that are smaller than like 6 nanometers are going to be eliminated pretty rapidly through the kidney and just kind of urinated out. They should be. And then as you talk about different particle sizes, now, if they get a little bit bigger, now we're talking, well, maybe the spleen will take care of that. Maybe the liver will take care of that. all these different pathways for dealing with particles of different sizes. And so basically, because of a lot of lack of standardization with these measurements, when it comes to this question of like, do I have, a spoon in my brain, a credit card in my body, whatever, the answer is we really have no idea. Several of these methods are really only validated for particle sizes that are way bigger than your typical microplastics. And so they're kind of just using a thing that they know is not validated for things this small and frankly hoping for the best. And then others are just reporting some of these biologically implausible findings where you're like, well, a particle that big can't get through here, or a particle that small should have been eliminated through this. Like, as you start to kind of walk through all these different specifics of like this specific microplastic, which has this particle size being found in this area of the body, like I said, a lot of it just doesn't really seem to be biologically plausible. Now, the paper that I mentioned here is this is basically a validation attempt of something that they call pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry. And they were thinking, a lot of the other papers out there some are using this, some are using other techniques that are not validated and really not all that promising just because of their limitations with really small particle sizes. So this study was trying to validate, I believe, the same method that was used in the recent study that reported like, hey, you have like a plastic spoon in your brain or something along those lines. A paper that generated a lot of buzz.
Yeah,
And
the equivalent of a whole plastic spoon somewhere in your body, right?
yeah. And so this is this approach they were trying to validate. Pyrolysis is that first term. And so as you might deduce, this uses something called thermal decomposition. And the reason that's important is because this is an indirect analysis technique. And what it's really looking at is the thermal decomposition products. So these small organic molecules that should be, kind of the result of decomposition of these microplastics. They are not trying to identify the microplastic itself. Now, the problem is that there are a lot of endogenous compounds in our body, in our biological tissues, that have similar, they basically decompose into very similar molecules. And so what happens as a result, and what they found in this validation attempt, is this whole thermal decomposition technique works great when you're using, if you're doing testing on water to say like in the water supply, how much, microplastic content are we finding? But because the thermal decomposition, those decomposition products look so much like other biological things that can break down into similar decomposition products. Basically, they tried this using blood, and they were getting so much interference from other stuff in the blood that they're like, we just cannot use this as a validated way to try to quantify microplastic in the body. So, in summary, just wrapping this up with a little bow, and we're going to get to Tupperware in a minute. Okay. For microplastics. Microplastics are everywhere. It's not just a food thing, and it's not just a, plastic cutting board thing. We're talking clothing, we're talking air, water, everything. Dust. We don't know how much microplastic material is in the body, and most of the studies that you've seen that claim to know how much microplastic is in the body, or let's be honest, you read the headline. Like, no one's diving into these papers and saying like, well, wait, that's not an appropriate use of chromatography. Yeah. Like, yeah.
What's actually happening is someone took one of these studies and then claimed based upon it that therefore we have, it's like headline versus study, which we see all the time, right?
Yeah. And it's particularly bad. Like, listen, we get it in fitness. Like, a lot of people aren't necessarily reading the papers. Who's got the time? I totally understand that, not being judgmental. But it's one thing to say like, wait, they were doing how many workouts a week? Let me take a look at that. At least it's written in English. It's like, I understand the language of what we're talking about here. You don't want to get into these chemistry papers about nanoparticles. Like this stuff, you read it and you're like, what is happening in this paper? So absolutely zero people are reading the full text of these. And the reality is when you dig into it, a lot of this stuff is highly speculative and it's using quantification methods that absolutely are not validated for testing for microplastics in biological tissues. So
Gotcha.
really, really important to understand that.
So just to clarify, because this is all me learning live, which
Yeah,
is great. I get to be the avatar of the listener. This paper acknowledges all the places that we may be getting microplastics from, but says, hey, the main studies which have been used to infer the amount probably are not valid for actually assessing how much is in human tissue.
correct.
Wow. It
Yeah.
makes you wish. It makes you wish, Trex, that Frizzle et al., when they did the Magic School Bus experiments, had actually taken more detailed notes and maybe had some academic oversight. And to be clear, I'm not denigrating Miss Frizzle. She is the best bench presser of all time and has a special place in the iron culture lore. There is, documented footage for her from her in the 80s when this was still an unknown, close grip benching for Reds' side. That's 220 kilos, and she's what, maybe 60, 70 kilo woman. So she still gets her flowers, but it just makes you wish we'd had a little more foresight back then.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I do want to acknowledge, like, listen, we are privileged. We have a very smart audience. There will probably be some folks who have, backgrounds in analytical chemistry or biochemistry who are going to hear this episode and say, Eric, you should have mentioned this. You flubbed that line. So I will report back with all the feedback I get from people with a stronger background in analytical chemistry than me. But my read of the literature, which I'm trying to provide, my best read of it to the extent that a person with PhD, essentially in personal training, can do so. It seems to me that this paper was done in a very rigorous manner, and gave a really solid overview of the existing literature and said, hey, like some of these papers are not making sense in terms of how, like, explain to me how a particle of that size gets into this tissue. Like you can't, right? So, and they are arguing that a lot of these are there's really two main reasons that some of these prior papers are using methods that are they aren't just not validated yet. They probably will not be able to be validated. It's because they really suffer poor performance when particle sizes get tiny, as we see with some of these microplastics and nanoplastics. And number two, they're using lab techniques that are really subject to a lot of interference from things that are found in biological tissues rather than like pure water samples, for example. Now, one thing I do want to also mention is, Helms, that whenever you get a question about artificial sweeteners or non-nutritive sweeteners, people will say, are they good for this? Are they bad for that? And there are some questions where that is, you can answer that. But in many cases, you have to kind of remind people, like, well, take a step back. Because when you say non-nutritive sweetener, you're talking about yeah, I mean, it depends on if you want to say which ones are really popular, which ones are less popular, but we're talking about maybe 10-ish, like fairly popular compounds that may be found in a random food that you pull off the shelf. And they are fundamentally dissimilar from each other in terms of their structure. Every like pure chemistry or biochemistry characteristic you might want to look at, these are fundamentally different compounds. They are
Yeah.
not like from the same family, so to speak. The one
You got
thing they
sugar alcohols, amino acids, modified sucrose, all kinds
Yeah.
of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing they have in common is they're really sweet. So but that's not like that doesn't really fly in biochemistry. Is like what shape is the sweet stuff? A lot of different shapes, a lot of different functional groups on these molecules. So all that is to say, when we talk about microplastics and nanoplastics, just as a good example, in this validation study, they had to kind of call their shot and try to validate it for. In this one, I think they were looking at two specific microplastics for trying to validate this technique. But when you ask someone, well, what are some of the microplastics I should be thinking of out there? It's immense. Like way bigger list of things than just like what are the non-nutritive sweeteners. So all that is to say, like, we are so far away from having a really good answer on this. It's really important to recognize, like, not only is so far, it seems like just about all papers are using methods that are not really validated. We're not going to be able to just do like the validation paper for these microplastics. We're going to have to validate a technique and then validate it for like 100 different plastics.
Yeah. This reminds me of talking about like the microbiome in 2010,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah,
And it's like, yeah, is this good for gut health? And it's like, well, A, what does that mean? How do we measure it? And then how many different strains of bacteria are there? And we're like, let's check back in 15 years. And now 15 years later, after 2010, we have answers for like a very small number of specific types of microbiota and how they're impacted, and that the impact of those on physiology or outcomes we care about is even more constrained.
yeah.
So I imagine this is going to follow a similar time course.
Yeah, it's going to take some time. We're going to have to settle in and get kind of comfortable with the uncertainty. And I know it sounds like a cop out, but I'm sorry, folks. I did my homework. This is what I found. So, again, just summarizing, microplastics are everywhere. We don't know how much microplastic material is in the human body. And even if we did, we don't necessarily know how different microplastics would impact physiological function of different tissues at different concentrations, right? So, to actually make some of the claims a lot of people are making about microplastics, we have to really connect a lot of different dots here and say, once the concentration in this tissue gets above this level, we can expect this impact on physiology, which intuitively would lead to this health problem. You know what I'm saying? So we're a long ways off from that. However, there are things that if you decided you wanted to reduce your exposure to microplastics, you could do. Again, you cannot avoid it. So it's really important to be realistic and say we're in the attenuation game here rather than the avoidance game. So a few things you could do to reduce your exposure to some microplastics. One thing would definitely be pretty heavy duty water filtration. So using things like reverse osmosis, and there's some other specialized filtration processes that really target little teeny tiny things. So your like general like Brita filter at home, probably not going to do it. You need some pretty specialized water filtration. If you're not willing to go that step, a simpler thing would be just avoid bottled water, that is packaged and shipped and, sitting in plastic all the time, especially obviously the more that those are exposed to heat anywhere along the chain of custody, or a lot of sunlight, for example. So if you wanted to say, well, I'm not going to like put in several $1,000 whole house, like basically a water plant in my house. Maybe another step would be, well, maybe instead of doing a lot of plastic bottles, I'll focus more on, drinking filtered water when I can, and even just kind of transporting my water in glass or other non-plastic materials. I know for me, I actually started using mason jars instead of shaker bottles. I just put the little blender bottle, little spring thing in there. And that was just for convenience, really, more than anything. I like the wide mouth, and I could get a big case of them for like super cheap. So I didn't do that with microplastics in mind, but it actually is a pretty good substitute. Easy to scoop things into it, and you can get them on the cheap, and they're very durable. Oh, the main reason I got it now that I remember is obviously everyone hates when you close the shaker bottle, you shake it up, and it like goes everywhere because it wasn't totally tight. But then I had the problem where I kept over tightening it and cracking it, and like I don't know if that's just me because have
You're
you
the
ever done
Hulk,
that?
bro.
Have you ever done
Uh,
that though?
no, I have. I was
Yeah,
gonna say it's just you because of your massive man hands, but
well, I wasn't sure because like I've talked about like growing up as a kid, it was more noticeable when I was a kid, but I have Tourette syndrome, and one of the like a lot of times kids with Tourette's will get misdiagnosed as having obsessive compulsive disorder. So I was like, there's certain things that I have little quirks, and I think everybody does, but I think mine are
Sure.
turned up a little bit. But for me, it's like closing a jar. I'm like, I need that thing closed. So I'm not. I was like, I'm not sure if this is a relatable experience, but I've broken too many shaker bottles, and it pisses me off.
Well, I think what happens for those of us who may not have the same dialed up tendencies is you get it on there half cocked one of these times, you know, because you're maybe not as careful as someone like you would be. Spill it all over yourself, and then the next time you're like, "That's not going to happen again," and then you're like, oh, "Okay, overcorrected."
Yeah.
So I've done that.
Right. So water filtration is a good step, or if you want the kind of lighter version, maybe not drinking stuff out of plastic bottles as much. In terms of food selection, to the extent we can estimate it, maybe it seems like perhaps seafood, so especially like shellfish and fish that you eat whole, those are claimed to be some of the higher microplastic foods, which is not like to me that has some degree of plausibility because we do tend to find that shellfish and those little tiny fish that you eat whole, they also tend to be higher in other kind of environmental contaminants, right? They kind of suck those things up from the water, so that's why you got to be careful with certain fish with mercury poisoning and things like that. So I have seen some evidence indicating that maybe certain types of seafood, again, talking like sardines, shrimp, oysters, things like that, maybe have a little bit more than other foods. Certainly I've seen some sources of information claiming that particularly like ultra processed foods might have a little bit more, just based on some of the actual processing methods that kind of go into producing them. Obviously, that's a broad category, and that's a terrible like. I mean, what does it mean to say what I'm trying to get at in clumsy phrasing is different ultra processed foods go through different processing methods, right? And so it's really hard to say like all ultra processed foods are going to be having this extra exposure to microplastics. But one thing that I have seen as a kind of common recommendation is to kind of prefer things that don't spend a lot of time throughout their life as they're going from, you know, from the kitchen to the table, just wrapped in plastic or stored in plastic. And we do tend to find a lot of ultra processed foods. There's a lot of plastic packaging involved. For example, some of that may kind of leach onto the food product. So to the extent you can minimize that, great. That's going to be tough. A lot of foods packaged with some layer of plastic in the mix. It's hard to get around that. I've also heard, and again, some of these are more dubious than others in terms of the level of certainty, but I've heard that sea salt tends to have a little bit more potential for microplastic contamination than other sources of salt. So perhaps you might consider that in your salt selection choices. If food storage, obviously, this is where we're getting to the stuff that, the water filtration is an obvious one. The food selection one, I just want to put a layer of uncertainty over a lot of that. Food storage is pretty clear as well. Storing food in glass, ceramic, stainless steel seems to be a better option if you're trying to minimize this exposure. If you are going to use plastic containers, I will give a whole different set of recommendations for that when we get to the Tupperware section. All right, but for now, we could say generally eliminating or minimizing the use of plastic containers, lids, and wraps would be kind of the best you can do. With cooking methods, not heating plastic with food in it would be what they suggest. Even if it's labeled microwave safe, all those labels kind of came around before we were really thinking about any of this. And they're really more like, will this thing technically survive being microwaved, more so than like, do you promise this will not degrade any layers of the plastic and have any kind of leaching into my food? So yeah, avoiding using plastic containers, especially when they're being exposed to heat, high levels of acidity, and things of that nature, and just wear and tear.
Right.
So cutting into it, using plastic utensils, these are all things that just the physical wear and tear of those materials can lead to more microplastic leaching and exposure. Clothing choices, Helms. So
Oh
choosing
no.
yeah, and choosing natural fabrics like cotton, linen, hemp, bamboo, and wool. Who doesn't love a nice scratchy wool T-shirt? You know. Unfortunately,
Correct.
a lot of
Like
uh,
the
unfortunately,
majority of my clothes are probably mostly plastic.
yeah, I use a lot. I wear a lot of synthetic materials, and those are the ones that tend to have more microplastic exposure. Cosmetics and personal care. I've seen recommendations to avoid products that have polyethylene, polypropylene, PMMA, nylon 12, and acrylates. Anything with those little micro beads, those are those will get you for sure. Those are little tiny bits of plastic, generally speaking. And a general recommendation was to use just bar soaps when you can that are just packaged in non-plastic
Mm.
material. Household
Correct.
habits.
I'm basically just a Marvel superhero with the amount of
Yeah,
like Under Armour adjacent products that I get as
I'm a,
like
I'm a big
competing.
polyester guy.
Yeah, man, I have
Yeah,
so many fitness gear related things from various suppliers that this is bad news.
yeah. So household stuff, vacuuming with a HEPA filter, dusting regularly, especially wet dusting to make sure you're getting rid of some of those potentially airborne plastics. Avoid using plastic tea bags, and avoid using any kind of plastic kettles, cookware utensils, etc. Okay, now Helms, I do want to briefly touch on Tupperware, and then maybe we'll have a couple. Maybe we'll see some questions in the live chat that we can address. But for Tupperware, any kind of plastic food storage, if you want to avoid, there's kind of two considerations with kind of plastic food storage. One being microplastic exposure, the other being exposure to what we would call potentially endocrine disrupting compounds that are some plastic materials as they leach. They may impact the endocrine system to a modest degree. So things you can do with Tupperware and plastic food storage. Number one, avoid heat exposure. Even if it says, hey, this is microwave safe, heat is heat. So microwaving, pouring super hot food or liquid into that plastic container, that stuff can, if you wanted to be safe, if you were going to use a plastic material, you would wait for your food to cool before you transferred it into that and then put it into the refrigerator. And then when you were going to reheat it, you would put it onto something that's not plastic for that reheating process. Also, things that can degrade some of those plastic materials are anything that's really acidic or anything that has a lot of oil in it that can also kind of wear down those materials a little bit. Another thing that's important to recognize is that Tupperware was not really designed to be your day-to-day heating vessel that you pass down to your kids and their kids as like a family heirloom. You are supposed to kind of rotate and retire, meaning that they're
Mm.
not made to last forever. Even if you take really good care of them, they're going to get scratched up, they're going to get warped, they're going to get discolored, they're just generally going to degrade to some extent over time. Of course, one thing that you could do to slow that a little bit is hand wash using mild detergents. Avoid any really harsh scrubbing that could create little scratches in the on the surface of that plastic. You could choose containers that are marked number one, number two, number five. And those little markings kind of just tell you what kind of specific plastic they're predominantly made out of. Might be a good idea to avoid number three, number six, and number seven, based on what I've looked into. Not a bad idea to go with BPA free and BPS free plastics. And that's one of those sneaky things. A lot of them will say, "Hey, BPA free," but they're doing that little pre-workout thing where it was like, remember when
Ah,
D, it's been so long, I'm forgetting it was
DMAA.
DMAA, right? So everyone was like, "Hey, that's banned. You're not allowed to do it." And people were like, "Well, what if I put in DMAB, and like all
Yeah.
these other little derivatives that were basically the same thing.
I can modify meth in a lot of ways. We're fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's been so long, I forget all the little sneaky other acronyms that cropped up when DMAA initially got banned. But same kind of thing. BPA, everyone was like, "Hey, avoid BPA," and they're like, "All right, we'll throw in a little BPS and see how you like that." And it's like basically the same thing. So I think, generally speaking, my takeaway from looking into the Tupperware thing is like, if your goal is to minimize microplastic exposure and to minimize potential exposure to endocrine disrupting compounds, then you probably wouldn't be using Tupperware a lot. And if you did use it, it would be just for storing cool things that are not hot when they go in, that are not overly acidic. When you're washing it, you're doing it by hand pretty gently without heat, like you would have in a dishwasher. And so you really have to baby this stuff to the point that it is not a particularly convenient type of food storage option.
So go with Pyrex or glass,
Is
right?
pretty, yeah, go for glass, ceramic, even stainless steel if they do that. But yeah, so I want to be super clear. We just went through a big whole set of checklists of like, what would a person do if they were real? What could they do if they were really intent on reducing exposure to some of those things? And that's good. But if the question is, what should you do? My answer would be, I have no idea.
Can I ask a different question?
Yes.
So you talked about how where we're at right now is that someone would have to logically infer what would be the health outcome that would occur if someone did in fact build up sufficient microplastics in specific tissues. Now that would be the direct mechanistic evidence, or maybe even applied evidence if we had the way to actually look at that in experimental trials, 6 months of using Pyrex versus, Tupperware. We're probably not going to have that for ethical reasons and methodological reasons, but
Right.
I imagine there might be something, and you probably ran into this in the introduction in one of these papers you were looking at, on simple epidemiological relationships between people who we think might be exposed to more plastics versus others, or do we not even have that?
So I don't think we have like high quality evidence in that area because if you
I guess we can't
imagine,
stratify people as more or less plastic exposure because we don't have a way to measure it, right?
yeah, I think it goes back to where do they come from? So like if you were going to
Uh,
even like try to put some quartiles together about just like net microplastic exposure, it comes down to their clothing, their food, their
uh,
air, their water, how they cook, what they cook with, like the level of questionnaire detail you'd have to administer to try to get to that. That'll be a thing, by the way, I'm sure, if it's not already a thing.
uh,
I didn't look too much into the epidemiology on this because frankly, after looking at some of these methodological things, I was like, whatever you're going to tell me, I'm not going to buy it.
yeah, I mean,
Because
just think about the confounders. Like if
yeah,
you said, how many meals do you eat out of Tupperware? You were also asking, how often do you pack a lunch when you go to work? Are you potentially a bodybuilder? And do you sell Tupperware? Like there's so
yeah.
many
And
other
it's
things that are going to co-vary, right?
And a lot of them are just like, how often do you use plastic forks? How often do you use straws? How often do you drink out of a plastic water bottle? What kind of cutting board do
Yeah.
you use? Like,
Which you're inadvertently asking, how often do you eat out or get takeout? So you're going to
yeah.
get all these false associations,
Yeah, I mean, if you thought food frequency questionnaires were bad,
Oof.
like trying to get an idea of a person's net overall microplastic exposure, I we will figure out how to do it, I'm sure, but it's going to take a hell of a survey or questionnaire battery and it's going to be quite a fun process validating it. Because even if we wanted to, like a
Good
lot of
luck.
times with with a lot of epidemiological survey tools, the way that they validate them is against some kind of bio. A lot of times it's against some kind of biomarker, right? So, like for example, we might say, "Hey, we think we're gonna, you know, have this questionnaire that helps us figure out your vitamin E intake or something, and then they'll just take blood samples and say, okay, well, the people who had higher blood vitamin E levels, did that correlate with, people who seem to score high on this vitamin E survey thing? Like, I don't even know how we would go about validating some of those surveys against just any kind of biological signal. So, to actually try to say like, yeah, I think we're really capturing something here. So all that is to
Hmm.
say, I I'm really not convinced that we even have good epidemiology. I'm not optimistic that we're going to have good, or at least certainly not a high volume of good randomized controlled trials that meaningfully control for exposure over a given time frame. I wouldn't even know how long does that study have to be. I mean, because
Yeah.
I would have to assume that microplastic exposure, we're really thinking about how much microplastic am I exposed to over the next 2 decades, more so than over the next 8 weeks.
I hope so.
Yeah, yeah. So all that is to say, this is very interesting, and I think it does put us in that unfortunate, humble position where we have to say we're gonna have to wait and see on this. And I will say this: if I can extend an olive branch, Helms, to some of the folks, I do think that sometimes in the evidence based fitness world, it's really appealing for people to kind of assert the null hypothesis as like a knee jerk
Hmm.
reaction in
Yep.
a way that can kind of be dismissive to folks that are just have a different kind of baseline comfort level with risk.
Yep.
And so what I'm getting at is, sometimes people will say like, are we necessarily sure that this particular food additive is safe? And a lot of times people in the evidence-based fitness world will be like, you're an idiot. Like if it was dangerous, they would have told us by now that. And sometimes it's like, well, if you really dig into it, we kind of just like decided that was generally recognized as safe in like 1908 and never revisited it. And there's not a lot of
Yeah.
good epidemiology on it. And like there's not a lot of evidence on certain things to help us really robustly determine the safety level of a given degree of exposure. And I think microplastics are one of those things where if you came to me and you said, I'm going to do what I feasibly can to minimize my exposure to microplastics, I have no grounds to call you an idiot for that. And I think
I
a
agree.
lot of evidence based fitness folks, certainly no one in the Iron Culture audience, but I think a lot of folks do kind of have that knee jerk reaction of like, if it were a problem, surely we'd know that by now. And therefore, it's kind of like the kind of like granola, like ultra naturalistic fallacy nonsense to actually be asking these questions and have any level of concern. And sometimes it really just, there's a lot of folks that overstate our certainty of like, just because we coexist with things and we acknowledge they're there doesn't mean we actually doesn't mean we actually cleared them, you
Yeah.
know?
And this is something that needs nuance too, because there is a big difference between microplastics, the microbiome, and certain well-studied artificial sweeteners and lead, And there's, like you said, a difference between how things were ran in 1905, 1975, the US versus Europe, and then 2025.
Yeah.
So people should take to heart the statement, evidence of absence is not the same thing as absence of evidence. Meaning,
Yeah.
like you said, if we don't have data showing something to be safe, that doesn't mean that it is safe. And we shouldn't rely on, in most cases, if this was dangerous, it should have been proven already, especially in things that have that certain kind of legacy. Because we have seen time and time again in society when things were not as well controlled, regulated, or tested for safety on the front end, we ran into problems. We used to include cocaine used to be like a pain medication that caused some issues.
Yeah.
Mercury used to be a treatment. Lead used to be used in pipes. Now, it is not
Yeah,
the same
there
society
are
today.
people who aren't even all that old who remember a time where people experienced in very inadvisable levels of lead exposure throughout their childhood through paint,
Unleaded
through
gasoline is a thing.
gasoline fumes.
Yep.
And that was a thing that a lot of people just said, well, it's there, it's around us. What are you going to do? And it's like, it's fine. And then we did the research after, you know,
Too
very
long.
long times of exposure. And oh, this is not good. And then, like, it tangibly impacted the health and wellness of the population when we took measures to reduce exposure to it. So I do think that it's important to have a little bit of humility if you're gonna actually be evidence based. And so this is one of those areas.
But
Yeah,
sorry, my point that I did want to get to is that that is fundamentally different, though, from not actually doing the homework to look at the things that have been
right.
pretty rigorously tested.
Yeah,
So, like for example, we made a social media post on mass about artificial sweeteners, and some people took that the very wrong way.
yeah,
And I engaged in the comments a little bit, like, "Oh no, hold on! Like we actually have acceptable daily limits for sucralose based upon some pretty robust data."
yeah,
And at least in the short term, and at least epidemiologically long term, I'm much more confident in saying, don't worry about reasonable intakes of sucralose. But with microplastics, just because I don't have data indicating it's safe, I don't understand what it will do. So those are different. Like there's a nebulous
yeah.
lack of evidence or a relatively clear constrained amount that is probably safe.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the conflation becomes a
Yeah, and
problem.
I'm probably picking the worst possible time in human history to extend this olive branch because right now in America we are like actively trying to ban at least a few things that actually have very strong track records of like robust safety data. So
Yes.
I do have to acknowledge this is not a good time to extend it, but it has to be at least addressed when you're talking about something like microplastics because this comes up anytime we talk about like this kind of fertilizer, this kind of dye, this kind of vaccine. And it's important to say, like, you need to first, like you said, Helms, do the homework and say, do we have robust, really rigorous evidence on the safety of a reasonable level of exposure to this thing? And in many cases, the answer is yes. So there are definitely a lot of folks out there who are unnecessarily and haphazardly applying this naturalistic fallacy, this appeal to nature fallacy, and saying, that's a synthetic thing, I don't like it. That's a synthetic thing, it seems dangerous. When in reality, we have plenty of evidence demonstrating the safety of those synthetic things in the types of exposure levels that a human actually experiences. But microplastics is one of the very small number of things that still falls under that umbrella of like, I can't tell you whether or not it is advisable for your health to take proactive steps to limit your exposure to these things. And then another sub question would be, would it do any good? Like,
Yeah.
and to me, that's the thing about microplastics that's really tricky is the fact that like it's one thing to decide whether or not exposure and minimization is advantageous, but it's another thing altogether. Like even if that is true in the abstract, it's like, well, what actually is the level of exposure we need to get to in order to minimize potential health risks? And would it be feasible to get down to that very low level if it is very low? Because yeah, like I said, we're talking clothing, cosmetics, air, water, food. Uh, it's not so simple as to say like, oh, I'm getting rid of my plastic cutting board and my plastic spatulas, and I'm going to wood across the board. Like that will minimize your exposure, but will it minimize it enough to do anything in the context of
Right.
this kind of perpetual background exposure? I have no idea. So my question to you, Helms, if I
Yes.
may, because I think I've said pretty much all I want to say on this.
Okay.
Having heard all that, are you going to do anything to minimize your microplastic exposure?
I am actually, because I think there are some things I can do. Um, so some things that I can do is we do use plastic cutting boards right now, and I just didn't think about it.
Yeah.
We did switch to Pyrex a little while ago, and I also tend to get diet sodas in plastic bottles, but there's no reason why, not at home, but when I'm out. So I will just start focusing on trying to get the cans.
Yeah.
So I think in my mind, it's like, what can I do that I'm not going to fundamentally change major aspects of my life on a lack of data, but I will take the low-hanging fruit.
Right.
So, so I guess not that I think everyone should use the same, qualities as me, but I'm going to operate from a pragmatic perspective rather than a fear-based perspective.
Yeah.
So, yeah, as far as wearing less plastic clothes, that one is where when I responded that way, I was like, that ain't gonna happen. I
Yeah.
can't. Like, it's just not gonna. Like, I don't have
Man,
a wardrobe.
I know I just love
Yeah,
a good loose fitting, synthetic
yeah,
breathable material. Oh my God. Yeah. And so I think this is really where it's interesting for people, because people are going to listen to this episode and they're going to say Trexler was flapping his gums for about an hour and didn't say shit. Because it was basically like, well, we know it's out there. We don't know how much. We don't know where it's going. We don't know if it stays. We don't know how much is too much. But when it really boils down to it, it's like, okay, after doing this homework and learning enough about it to talk about it for an hour, what are you going to do? And if the
yeah,
answer is nothing, that's very telling, right? I think for me, I'm in the same boat where I'm going to do the little tiny low hanging fruit things and say, like, okay, maybe I don't need to just invite this mega dose of microplastic exposure when it costs me literally nothing and is completely feasible to do option B instead of option A. And so I think the things you mentioned, I switched over to Pyrex, the glass storage containers a while ago. I don't use any saran wrap just because I don't have a need for it. I switched to mason jars instead of plastic shaker bottles because they're I don't break them and they close tightly enough to shake things. So little things like that. I think I haven't yet changed out my spatulas and cutting boards. I think I will probably do that. So maybe just wooden spatulas are usually a good alternative. Cutting board, either wood or what are you using? Are you still on plastic?
that's what I need to swap out.
Yeah, so maybe either wood or is there do they do glass cutting boards? Because I've heard
They do glass
the
cutting
wood
boards.
ones I think are a little trickier in terms of like maintaining
Cleaning.
bacteria. Yeah, like
Yeah.
they're a little more porous. They hold on to a little more bacteria. So pick your poison, Helms, literally.
Yeah, I'll have to talk to my wife and see what she thinks about those because she won't go wood on cutting boards because she
Yeah,
thinks it's disgusting and fair enough.
yeah,
But now I just need to scare her as to the plastics and then we'll figure out what we land on.
yeah,
Maybe we'll just cut on our granite tabletop and be like whatever.
yeah. To me, that's more gross than the wooden cutting board. But yeah, that's between you and
I would
the
think
members of your
facetious.
household.
Yeah, yeah.
I've
So
seen people do that. People do it. Not me though. But yeah, so I think one last thing I want to say is I don't want to fuel any hyperbolic panic about microplastics. The reality is it's a brave new world out there. We've been making a lot of synthetic materials for a long time. It's not really feasible when these new materials are made for governing bodies to say, okay, prove to me this will never be a problem in any context, regardless of how people use them. It's just not how the world functions. And so the inevitable results of that, which is a reality of life, is that we are currently, I don't care where you are, we are currently living in the midst of some exposure that will be deemed in the future to be harmful and will be minimized. Like that is a reality about the world around you you have to accept. I'm certain that there are things right now that you are exposed to in some capacity that we will find are negative for your health.
you know what I was reading this morning, Trex?
What?
I was reading a paper on screen exposure and greater risks of nearsightedness,
Yeah.
and I was reading it on my screen, and I thought, this is something I
And
can't do anything
size
with.
36 font, right?
I'm just like,
Yeah.
there's what am I gonna do? Am I gonna
Yeah.
not look at my computer or my cell phone as I'm it's completely impossible. So some things you just have to accept and move
You
along
got to
and be
take
like,
it on
that's
the
the
chin.
cost of being it's the cost of being human,
Yeah.
right? You know?
Yeah. So all that is to say, like, I can't vindicate microplastics and say I promise that there's no possible issue at any level of exposure because no one can really do that for you right now. I'm also clearly not panicked about it like having read into it, I'm like, this could go a lot of different ways. I do like our body's pretty good at filtering out a lot of crap and degrading a lot of crap, even as it kind of accumulates to some extent. So there's just a lot of unanswered questions, and I haven't seen enough within this literature to make me go, oh my God, I need to dramatically change my life. But I have seen enough where I'm like, well, I don't like the idea of walking around with plastic. And who knows how much is actually in there. I'm assuming that the true value is greater than zero, but less than a spoon, if I had to guess.
That's fair.
And yeah, it seems to me if it's not a huge burden and it's feasible, why not make a couple little swaps that don't dramatically alter your life in order to say, you know what? I mean, you can look down at the plastic cutting board and say, hey, there's big old divots. Where did it go? Like
Yeah.
that's not a fun thing to realize. You can look at your Tupperware and say, that stuff's in rough shape. It's clearly degrading before my very eyes. Where did it all go?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of stuff that kind of makes you think twice. And I think those are some low hanging fruit that you can probably pluck off the old tree and move on with your life without being absolutely panicked about microplastics. One other thing I noticed the other day, I mentioned it in the other episode. I did look into that paper about like living in a certain proximity to golf courses and the risk of
Oh,
Parkinson's disease. And dude, there's just some stuff out there. There's just some environmental exposures that we experience where it's like sometimes the best you can do is like say, hey, maybe I'll throw in a little water filter if I live near a golf course, the faucet from which I drink the most water. And outside of that, I'm gonna keep on keeping on, do my best.
just get plastic bottled water. Oh, wait, that's what spurred this whole thing when
Yep,
I brought that up last time when you talked about the golf
it's
course.
tricky.
It is. So, Trex, I'm thinking you check out the mass YouTube. I'll check out the Iron Culture YouTube. And why don't we specifically look at questions that might be related to our discussion on plastics to make sure we covered everything, even if many of our answers will be "don't know, bruh," and then maybe call it there. What do you think?
All right. Yes. Do you see anything in the Iron Culture chat at the moment?
Yeah, and there's one that's related to this.
Cool.
Has there ever existed a caffeine-free Mountain Dew? And this is loosely related because we'd recommend getting the canned version, but I'm also just curious.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, you can find a caffeine-free Mountain Dew, no question. And
Wow,
and
because
I
I thought that'd just be off-brand for it's like, it came out of the gates with we're jumping off cliffs, parachuting, and doing X Games.
yeah, one of the things that sucks though is you got to go to a really well-equipped grocery store because like
Mm,
presumably, I mean, I know for me knowing how beautiful calories are, I can't waste them on a full sugar soda. Like at any time. It doesn't matter if I'm off season, in season, whatever.
100%.
So I'm like, I'm going the diet version every time. Sometimes it's hard to get the double asterisk, where it's like you go to a grocery store and it's like they have their Mountain Dew, they have Diet Mountain Dew, and they have caffeine free Mountain Dew. But will they have the diet caffeine free Mountain Dew? And sometimes that is tough, but it exists.
And will they have the caffeine-free Diet Mountain Dew in a can?
Yes.
And then will it be Code Red or Baja? Because
No
that's
chance.
going to be that's going to be
No
tough,
chance.
right?
Yeah. So
Okay.
so in a perfect world, if I were in charge, I would just send a customizable soda fountain to the home of all of my constituents, and you could mix and match and get your perfect titrated soda, and everyone would be happy. And I feel like I'd get elected to at least 6 or 7 terms.
Got my vote.
Yeah.
P. Sherman asks, will we be talking PFA's forever chemicals today? And I think you did mention that you want to buy stuff that is free of those specifically, or is that one we did not cover?
Forever chemicals are kind of this other category of just these like
Mm,
synthetic chemicals to which we're exposed usually through environmental means, and they do find their way into the water supply. A lot of public like water treatment plants do not use sophisticated enough processes to actually filter out those forever chemicals, and the reality is we consume them. and they're called forever chemicals because they're nasty little sons of guns, and they stick around for a while. And I do know that actually that hits a little close to home because in North Carolina there was a company that was doing a lot of chemical dumping into one of the big rivers out there in eastern North Carolina. And this river was part of a really substantial. It was part of the water supply for a really large swath of land out there, including the area of Wilmington, North Carolina, which is a pretty big city. And they had some of these forever chemicals in the water. The water quality was very, very poor. It became the kind of thing where there were health issues that arose from it. There were clusters of, I think, certain cancers that arose. So, yeah, I think, to be totally honest, like, if a person told me that they were like, you know what, financially I'm in a place to swing it, and I feel like I really want to invest in a pretty substantial water filtration system for my home. I don't think that's the craziest thing in the world, to be honest. Especially for me, I live out in the country. I live on a well. Like my water source is just a private well in my yard. Lord knows what's going on down there. You know, it's not going through a treatment plant where they're doing quality testing. Even if it is going through a treatment plant with quality testing, the quality testing's pretty bare bones. Like they're not going the extra mile to check for some of these like really nasty, pesky little forever chemicals and stuff. I don't think it's the craziest thing in the world if you can swing it to actually invest in a more substantial like whole house filtration system, but they're expensive. And so like
Yeah.
realistically that's not a feasible option for the vast majority of people. And it's what a when you own a home, for example, like there's certain things you spend money on and you're like, oh, this is great. You know, it's like you're improving the house in a way that is like you feel like you're getting something out of it. What a not fun way to spend a large chunk of money is just to get water, and you're like, I feel like this is healthier water, you know?
It's reducing your amount of time spent ruminating, which for some people, if they don't have
Yeah.
much control over that, may be well
But
worth it.
you know what I mean though? It's like it's
No,
way cooler to
100%.
like add something to your house than to just fix a thing that broke and be like, great, now I have a non-leaking roof again. Like you don't really feel like you got anything fun out of the deal. Same thing, like I don't think it's the craziest thing, especially depending on where you live. Not all water systems are equal in terms of their, quality and things of that nature. Yeah, for some of those forever chemicals, like I think the best you can do is try to avoid products that may use them as I think I don't know if they've regulated these out of the picture, but there were some, I think maybe non-stick materials that had some of these forever chemicals. Definitely environmental exposure through water. I think the best you can do is just try to minimize exposure to them, but they're definitely pesky.
Gotcha. All right. One comment and one question from Vasily. There was research showing lead was harmful in gasoline decades before it was regulated. The profit motive of private industry mainly motivated this, always a concern. And the good news is we are talking about this not because people are trying to regulate microplastics at the moment, but because there's interest into the research. So hopefully we'll have some answers in the research even before there is anything done, if anything ever is done, and from regulatory bodies.
Yeah. And that's, I think that's an instance where, regardless of your kind of political alignments and philosophies, if we do happen to find that, microplastics are accumulating to a level that is having a tangible negative impact on the health of the population, it's a lot easier to regulate them out of the supply for some of these things that are so hard to avoid. It's like that's a place where regulation kind of shines, right? Is when it's on the onus of the companies producing these materials to say, hey, you gotta cool it. Like it's one thing to say like, hey, I don't really feel, just as a total hypothetical, if you're like, I don't really feel all that comfortable with aspartame, so as a consumer, I'm going to choose to avoid it. It's not all that hard to avoid aspartame, right? But when we're talking about avoiding microplastics, it's like that's like a systems level thing in order to contain exposure.
Yeah, especially you could. It's tough in a let's say a fully free market system where everyone's using it. what's the motivation for someone to stop using it? I mean, you could go, oh, we're going to stop using it and specifically market to a very kind of, as you said earlier, like crunchy crowd,
Yeah.
granola. But unless it carries on with some type of zeitgeist, which is going to happen after the fact,
Yeah.
to where people are like, oh, this is harmful. So yeah, it's a tough thing. And then Vasily's question is, maybe I missed it earlier. Did you guys cover the risk of plastics due to surgery? In other words, implants and replacements, etc.
I don't know a doggone thing about that.
But
I
this is like literally putting plastic in someone's body. So I would think, I could be wrong, but I think, well, I guess things like certain cosmetic surgeries, maybe they would be plastic analogs. But I think for
yeah.
a lot of things like knee replacements, hip surgery, a lot of times we're talking about metal.
Yeah. I would like to think that they are very thoughtful about the specific type of plastic that's going in. Because like theoretically you would hope they're choosing one that certainly is not subject to rapid degradation, where you're gonna have small particles kind of, floating around.
Yeah, don't let your knee get hot because it's gonna melt,
Yeah.
or don't let your knee degrade from contact. And you're like, that's literally what happened to why I'm here, you know?
Yeah, yes. I would like to believe that there's been some forethought and some foresight going into like what is a truly inert material that can be put in that will not degrade and leach smaller particles throughout the body. But you're gonna have to ask somebody else because that ain't me. I really have no idea.
I think that's totally fair. You got anything in the mass chat?
Yes. Steven said, I smoked weed like a pig and drank lots of alcohol for 50 years. Now I'm worried about Tupperware, which is a funny way to look at it. But
Absolutely.
yeah, at least the other stuff was probably a little more fun. It's eating out of Tupperware is not exactly an exciting process. All right, we had another one in here. Someone said they're going to start removing their food from the plastic packaging before they eat it. That is definitely advisable for sure. There were some real ones. One more joke one. Would microplastics in my body count as lean mass? Yes. Uh, I would say so.
They're fat free at the very least, right?
Yeah, it definitely is fat free mass. I'd be curious to see it with underwater weighing, what kind of density those materials are. But yeah, probably so. Steven said he uses a metal soup ladle because he eats a lot of soup. That's definitely one where it makes a lot of sense. Like you're literally dipping it into super hot liquid on a regular basis. Metal, wood, anything that's not plastic for that probably is kind of the more prudent call there. Although I know that every ladle in my home right now, I believe, is plastic. So we'll get on that. And then we had one. What about cooking skillets? And I actually have no idea what a lot of those cooking skillets are actually made of. Do
So
you?
I think this is one where they have the non-stick pans,
Yeah.
and that was, I think, one of the main regulatory areas where they're like, listen, you got to make these out of something else, which I think had some of the quote unquote forever chemicals in them, if I recall correctly. Does that sound right, Trex?
Probably. Like, I'll be honest. There,
Yeah,
there's a
we're over our skis
there's a
here.
lot of cookware where they're like, "Oh my god, this stuff is incredible. It doesn't stick." And then they're like, "Yeah, but you can't. You can't be eating off of that, brother, and you can't be cooking food at high heat on that." So I'm kind of in a perpetual state with those materials of kind of a quiet acceptance of like, I understand that a lot of these cooking materials are probably not great for me, and even when they do say, "Hey, are bad. We've been told to change our material from version 1. Here's version 2." Do I necessarily trust that version 2 we're not going to find out in 6 years that they've switched to version 3 due to the same exact concerns? The reality is with a lot of these cooking surfaces and like pots and pans, for example, that are coated with things, I don't have a lot of expertise in them. I do view them with a high degree of skepticism in general, but not to the extent that I actually do anything about it. It's one of those things where I'm like, you know what?
There.
I am probably exposed to much bigger. I probably have a lot more problems in my future than whatever I'm getting from exposure to this cookware or this what's the term I used, skillet, the top of the skillet. I think you can hold both things at the same time. Being number one, I probably wish this was made out of something slightly different that didn't leach out any chemicals or any microplastics. At the same time, it's probably not going to catch up with me. Of all
Yeah.
the various potential health issues on the table, I don't think the skillet's going to get me. I think something else will. I know that that's like, it's not a satisfying answer, but like the reality is this is a whole field of study. This kind of you know epidemiological analysis of exposure to different environmental contaminants, different household items, different elements of cookware and the food supply. There's a whole field of study out there that gets really, really murky, and I don't have all the it's easy enough. Like when we talk about like nutrition and fitness, we can really boil a lot of that down into a few key variables, a few key stimuli, a few outcomes of interest, and all the questions we get are really just kind of mixing and matching the main characters of the story here. But it's important to take a moment to appreciate and recognize that when you shift that research question to one of exposure to things in the household or environment, you are talking about a world of exposures and stimuli and research questions that is like going from a county to a galaxy in terms of how much ground can be covered. So all of that's a very a grand way of me saying I have no freaking idea what skillets are made of or what I
Yeah.
would make them out of if it were my call. But it speaks to a broader point of when we're kind of, I think it's really important as we wrap up tonight to reiterate. We've been really clear about the fact that you can't just say categorically like I'm certain that this can't backfire. Really high exposure to these things. We've been really clear about that, but it's also important to recognize that like as a human, we go throughout life taking risks every day. Some of them we're aware of, some of them we're not. And if you were to kind of put together like in for my risk profile of what I'm doing today, where does cooking on a skillet or using a nonstick pan or drinking out of a plastic water bottle, where is that falling on the list of priorities or the list of highest risk to lowest risk or the spectrum of most likely to screw me over to least likely to matter in my life? It's important to recognize that this stuff, as far as we know, is pretty far down that list. So like today I did not train. That is far more dangerous to me in the aggregate than the fact that if I drank out of a plastic bottle or if I used Tupperware to cook or used a nonstick surface. So like
Trex, did you drive anywhere today?
that's another example I had right on top of mind is, I didn't drive today, but if I had, that would have been one of the riskier things I did today. And so it's really important to just have that context in mind of when we're talking about minimizing some of these exposures, we're talking about like maybe a small probability of a net impact on your lifespan of something between like 0 days and I don't know, throw out a number that's not very big. We're talking about, or perhaps another way of putting it is if you're concerned about developing some kind of, especially in the case of like forever chemicals, developing like an ultra rare cancer due to very high exposure. We're talking about reducing your risk from almost certainly not going to get this to a slightly lower risk than that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's really important to keep in
Yeah.
mind probabilities, magnitudes, and these kind of rank ordered lists of what are the health behaviors I can engage in today that are most likely to make an impact. If you're engaged in fitness in a meaningful way, you are probably already doing most of the really big stuff on a day-to-day basis. Like the most important things you could do are use safe transportation, don't use any dangerous drugs, don't drink and smoke, or at least drink in moderation, as we've covered in much more nuance, right? Avoid high dose exposure to obvious carcinogens, eat well, not too much of it, be physically active. The stuff we're talking about is falling way further down on the list.
Get some sleep. And
Yes.
yeah, all the big ones. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it's tough when you talk to a bunch of optimizers because they're looking to find the things they're not doing, and like you said, there are known unknowns, there are unknown unknowns, and I will say that rumination, stress, and obsessing over things that you don't have much agency over. There are some pretty consistent findings in psychological research that the more you focus on things where you don't have agency, the less self-efficacy you will have, and that does seem to have a direct negative effect on mental health. So I would definitely, to Trex's list, focus on the things you can do, not the things that we don't know about. That even if you could potentially know about, which we're not there yet, you don't have a whole lot of agency to do. So grab the low-hanging fruit, and then I would, out of sight, out of mind. I'm not saying put your head in the sand as an ostrich, but focus on what you can do.
Yeah.
Um,
And if
Final.
God forbid, if you opt out of social situations because you're worried that you're going to be more exposed to microplastics by default, I promise you the health ramifications of loneliness are more dangerous. Well, I can't make that promise with absolute certainty, but I very strongly suspect that that's the case.
Yeah, there are health risks associated with never leaving your home, not
Yeah.
getting sun exposure, not having a social support network. That's
Yeah.
for sure. And hey, that whole third part of our understanding of human motivation, the interconnectedness, relational stuff, it's there. So, Trex, I don't have any more in the iron culture questions related to microplastics, unless you've got any more in mass. I think we could probably wrap this sucker up.
I I don't think I have any more here, and I think that means we get to wrap up what is honestly, I would say, the most uncomfortable podcast episode that I've recorded in years, in many years.
It might be uncomfortable, but I would say it probably has more actionable information than anything you've ever produced.
Well, there was like a whole list, yeah. No, but this was, not to use a very cliche term, but this was a big old step out of my typical comfort zone. But at the end of the day, I think that's important. Taking off my, I'm not going to take off my hat, but if I did take off my scientist hat and put on my practitioner hat, Helms, the first time we talked about this, you mentioned that you're like, I don't really want to give a big evidence-based answer because I'm not up to date on the evidence, but I used to get this question all the time working one-on-one with clients. And the reality is a lot of people who listen to our content do work with other folks, or they run into these questions every now and then. And I think one of the things about being, evidence-based, quote unquote, is we also have to sometimes just make decisions in our daily life. And sometimes the evidence is not to our liking. And we have to say, well, I would sure love a more clear and obvious meta-analysis on this topic in a population just like me to tell me what to do. But either way, we have to make a decision. We have to do something. And sometimes you do have to get out of your comfort zone, make your best assessment and appraisal of what we know and what we don't know, and then boil that down to what am I actually going to do with this information. And if nothing else, this episode was kind of a concrete example of exactly that, where if you're a personal trainer and your client says, how much should I be worried about microplastics and what might I do to avoid it, and how much should I stress over that? I think this episode at the very least delivers on that.
I would agree. And I think you did a great job, and I appreciate you taking the time to get outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah, and I'm just waiting. I'm going to be off the internet for 7 days as the hate mail comes in, and all of the analytical chemists out there say, Eric, you fool. Here is my dissertation about your misunderstanding of detecting nano and microplastics in biological tissues.
And then we'll know so much more.
Exactly.
It's a wonderful opportunity, Trax.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Like if you know something about this and you're like, Eric, you idiot, you should have mentioned this or you misstated that, let us know and we will rake me over the metaphorical coals in the next episode and make sure everyone gets the best possible information, because ultimately, Helms, that's what we're all about here at Iron Culture. Is this show predominantly to serve our egos? Yes. But a close second objective is to make sure that we put out good information on a regular basis that helps people navigate life, and specifically with regards to their health and their fitness. So, folks, if we get any updates on this topic, I will let you know. But this is a topic that gets talked about a lot, but I haven't seen a lot of people really dive into it in a deep way. And after looking at the literature, I'm very sure why.
Yep.
It's a lot to kind of wade through out there. So, everyone, I hope you're interested in microplastics. If so, this episode, you are like a pig in the mud. If you're not all that into microplastics, there's always next episode. And we will be back in 1 week with another episode of Iron Culture. Thanks so much for joining us. Before we go, if you like it, if you want to support it, many ways to do it. Make sure you like, rate, subscribe, review, share it with a friend. Give it 5 stars. Do your thing. And of course, if you really love what we're doing, the Mass Research Review makes all of this possible, so you can be an ultra mega gold star supporter by becoming a member of the Mass community. You can learn more about that at massresearchreview.com. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Avoid plastic to the maximal extent that you possibly can, because it is in your house. It's trying to kill you, and we will see you in 7 days.